Hello friends, this is Growl. This is going to be my 9.0.5 Disc Priest guide. This is going to be half and half. Part of it is going to be my thoughts on the changes and what I'm running now versus what I was running at the beginning of the patch and any updates to the guide. Also, it's going to be me talking about more higher keys and more focus on pushing higher content. I think most of what I have in my initial guide for Disc Priest is very, very relevant. So if you're just starting off, you're trying to gear up, I would recommend that video over this video, and I'll leave a link to that in the description. This is more meant for people who are already have geared up, already have some experience in keys, and are looking to go and push higher. So with that, I also want to say that I've been really super busy lately, and I've been wanting to put out some stuff like this, but I haven't really quite had the time. So I'm going to be really light on editing and not do anything crazy. We're just freeballing this here. I want to get some good content out there, and I want to give you guys my thoughts on a lot of the changes and, you know, what I've been doing in high keys and how you guys can push up higher as well. So I apologize that it's a little bit freeform, but I'll leave timestamps in the description for you guys to, if you have certain questions about just covenants or just this or just that, it'll all be there. So for starters, let's talk about stats. For Disc Priest, you want item level and haste. Pretty much nothing has changed. Haste, haste, haste. Haste is so good for Disc Priest. The reason for that is you have so many buttons to press. Disc Priest is the only healer where you mostly mandatory need to weave in DPS and healing. For other healers, it's like, well, you're just stop doing DPS and focus on healing. But Disc Priest, you have so many abilities, penance, mind blast, and whatever your covenant ability is, you're going to need to weave in DPS and healing abilities. Also, haste is just really, really good for Disc Priest to be able to pump out a lot of healing in a short window, like a Radiance or a Rapture or something like that. Also, with Kyrian Boon, haste is great as well. Other than haste, you just want really any stats, honestly. Item level and haste is most important. I tend to favor crit and verse, especially verse, because verse gives you not only damage but also damage reduction on yourself. And one of the big weaknesses that you can have as priest is that you're just vulnerable. You don't have good defensives and you're just very vulnerable to dying. So for instance, you'll see on my priest, not only do I have 12% verse, but I also have 8% avoidance and a little bit of leech as well. I prioritize these stats on priest a little bit more than other classes just because I worry about my own life. Whereas a class like Druid, not only am I sturdier, but I'm also more mobile. Whereas Priest, you're weak and you're slow, which is also part of the reason why I run Goblin. Now for trinkets, the easy go-to for Priest is the 2 PvP trinket. You have the haste with the int proc, which is really, really strong. And then you also have the on-use 1-minute badge. Part of the reason I use badge is because I also play Mindbender, and badge plus Mindbender pairs really, really well together. But if you're not using Mindbender, if you choose to use Solace instead, which many priests do, you can be a little bit more flexible with your trinkets. You can run, I think running double or no on-use trinkets is reasonable. If you have badge and changeling or hymnal, any of those trinkets are fine. Another option is to use a DPS trinket. You can use something like Soul Igniter to help on AoE, or also just either Glyph of Assimilation or Dreadfire, or something that just gives you some single target damage to help with time. Another option that you'll see Disc Priest using is the Feather, the Tuft from Sun King. This is a great trinket to help with single target healing. As Disc Priest, if someone's in danger, you really don't have a lot of tools to help them besides your externals and just spamming Shadow Mend. You don't have a lot of consistent single target healing. So Tuft is another great spell, or just a great thing that you can use on somebody. The downsides of Tuft, though, are that it doesn't help with your damage at all. So using this versus using something like Alacrity or Ferocity is going to reduce your damage, but it can be something that's really helpful if you're playing with a tank that's taking a lot of damage, or certain mechanics that might be really, really tough to deal with. Ideally, though, you're just looking for haste and intellect and stats. Now we'll talk about legendaries. Honestly, not a lot has changed for legendaries. The go-to is going to be Twins of the Sun Priestess. A lot of people want to make something else. Oh, I don't play with organized groups. I don't play, you know, oh, I don't play with a fire mage, blah, blah, blah. It doesn't matter. Twins is not for your group. Twins is for you. As a priest, if you have PI, you should be using PI on your DPS 95% of the time. The only 5% is, you know, in an emergency or whatever. But if you're just throwing it out because you're worried about dying. It's not a 2-minute cooldown that you're going to need every time. And Twins gives you that extra haste for yourself. So for instance, right at the start of a pull, you use PI on the mage or the boomy, or probably not the boomy, but whoever needs haste. And then not only do they get the haste, but you get this big haste infusion where you have 60% haste and you're just spamming out Shadow Word Pains. You're getting all your dots up, you're getting your atonements up, and it helps you really build up at the start of the pull. Even though it might not be a situation where you're using it to, like, you know, spam a bunch of healing, you almost use it to help you build up all your dots and stuff, because Shadow Word Pain is a really, really efficient button to press, and it helps keep your tank and your party topped, and it does good damage. However, or Purge the Wicked, sorry. I say Shadow Word Pain, but it's the same ability. It's something that it can be hard to press, because if you fall behind, it's not going to help you catch up, but you want to have them ideally up consistently. So it helps your damage, it helps your healing, it's just great for setup. Alternatively, one legendary that was buffed that I haven't got a chance to try lately was the Shadow Word Death legendary. If you're not planning on playing Shadow or Holy and you're just not raiding either, like ideally you make this for raiding too. And if you have the extra Soul Ash though, I would really recommend trying this. I feel like Kiss of Death is kind of being slept on right now. Probably no one's playing it, but I bet it's a really fun Lego and good for your damage. It's also good for execute. So for example, there are plenty of times when either a boss or a pride where it gets to low health and you're out of cooldowns and your team's out of damage and it seems to sit at low health for a really long time. Kiss of Death gives you extra healing and damage when the mob is below 20%. So I'm not sure if it's good, but I think this is, like, to me, Kiss of Death is much more fun to play than either Crystalline Reflection or Pentient one. I know a lot of people try to go to these because they're passive and they're easy, but if you're looking for a good legendary, you should play Twins. If you're looking to try something and you want something that's more fun, you should play Kiss of Death, or at least try it. Let me know how it goes. If any of you have played this Lego since the changes, I decided to make other stuff on my priest, but this is probably going to be one I make next. I made it on my helm. I put crit haste on it. In hindsight, maybe I should have put haste verse, but honestly the crit is good because I have a lot of verse from PvP gear anyway, that, you know, usually you kind of, it's more of like a seesaw with crit and verse. The more crit you have, the better verse becomes. The more verse you have, the better crit becomes. So you kind of want to mix of both. It's hard to know, but either way, just make sure there's haste on your Lego. So now we'll talk about Covenant. So at the beginning of the expansion, I said Kyrian is the best Covenant for Mythic Plus, and then I went Venthyr, and everyone's like, "Growl! Oh my God, you went Venthyr! Is Venthyr?" Well, nothing's changed, right? Kyrian is super good, and now you'll see I'm here in Kyrian, but there's a lot of merit to Venthyr too. So here's what Venthyr is good at. Number one, it's so much better for raid. If you're seriously progression raiding, if you care about HPS, you pretty much need to play Venthyr. You're not going to be able to compete with any other Covenant but Venthyr, because Venthyr lines up with every Spirit Shell. Maybe if you're playing Evangelism, which is somewhat more viable now that the Spirit Shell's been nerfed, you can play something else. But honestly, if you're raiding or PvPing a decent amount, play Venthyr. The other benefit to Venthyr is that there's a shortage of Venthyr in Mythic Plus. Not a lot of groups need Venthyrs. A lot of the meta DPS play Night Fae or Kyrian, and so you're left with wanting Necrolord or Venthyr. And so being Venthyr is great for your group. That's why you'll see a lot of priests still being Venthyr, although the Kyrian ability is really, really good. One of the problems with this priest is that you have a hard time pushing everyone's health up. You have great cooldowns with Barrier, with Rapture, keeping their health topped, with Pain Suppression, keeping atonements with your Shadow Word Pains. But let's say everyone gets hit hard, or your team, you know, whatever, your team's monkeys, and you need to do big healing. Kyrian Boon is the only button that you can press that does tons of group healing. If I talk about it a little bit in my video, but here's the way that you want to use Kyrian Boon. Ideally, you want to have PI on someone else on your team, and you want to have any unused trinkets like IQD or Badge. And Ideally, you can proc Twist of Fate as well because it's going to give you that huge healing and damage increase. If you can get some or all of those things active when you use Boon, it's just like a 10-second fully top your group do infinite HPS in Mythic Plus. So you're basically popping Boon, and then all you're doing is blasting and then novaing. That's all you're doing, is just going back and forth between blast and nova. Depending on how much haste you have, you can maybe only use one nova per blast. The blast is so much better than nova. So for instance, on single target, you'll see here, even though I press nova a lot more than blast is doing double the damage, and it's also building up more stacks of for the eruption. So blast is higher priority. You always want to press blast, and you just want to keep pressing blast and nova. And if you're pairing things with that, like your trinkets, your PI, all that stuff, you're not going to need to do any healing. The only time that you'd want to stop in a boon to heal somebody is if they're like one person specifically is going to die. But even that boon is doing so much healing. So boon is very, very strong. Personally, I haven't played Necrolord or Night Fae. I'll share some thoughts on Night Fae. I don't really, I don't see too many Just Priests playing Necrolord, but we'll talk about Night Fae a little bit because a lot of people are asking about Night Fae. Bro, Night Fae's buffed. Should I play Night Fae? The Wowhead guide says Night Fae's bis or whatever. Here's the thing with Night Fae. Night Fae is not necessarily that good for you, especially as a Just Priest. So Night Fae gives you mana, which is nice, but it's not that much mana. And it reduces the cooldowns for your allies, and it gives you DR on the tank. This Priest already has really, really good tank externals. You have Pain Sub, you have Rapture, you have Barrier. You don't necessarily... granted, DR on the tank is nice, but you don't necessarily need it, right? It's not really a whole... It's not the same thing that something like Kyrian Boon fills, where it fills that void that Disc Priest really needs. However, what it does give that's really powerful is cooldown reduction on somebody else. So if you're in an organized group where you can feed someone who's really good and really geared and is doing tons of damage, it's possible that Night Fae can be more damage and help kill stuff faster. However, there's two drawbacks with Night Fae. Number one, if your player that you're juicing isn't very good, you're losing a lot of healing power from it, right? If you're not getting that much damage from it, if they're not getting more combustions, the most common use is using it on a mage for combustion. If they're not getting good combustions, if they're not getting more combustions in the dungeon, you're essentially wasting your covenant ability, right? So that's something that you have to be careful with picking. And the other downside is that nobody needs Night Fae. There are no shortage of Night Faes in Mythic Plus. Like every druid, every mage, like so many people are playing Night Fae right now that you don't like. Being Night Fae isn't going to help you get into groups and help fill a void in the same way that Venthyr will. Kyrian, it's tough because everyone kind of has Kyrians too because of tanks, but I feel like Kyrian is at least slightly more needed than Night Fae, whereas Night Fae is just no one needs a Night Fae. And I feel like as a healer, you probably want to be a covenant that helps your team rather a covenant that your team needs for that bonus. If you're pugging, it doesn't matter that much. Or let's say you're playing with a Venthyr Bear, right? Or a Venthyr whatever tank, Demon Hunter, he's an edge, and you don't need a Venthyr. Yeah, maybe you could play Night Fae, but I would personally look, if you want to try it, definitely try it. But like if you're asking me if you should play Night Fae, you probably shouldn't be playing Night Fae. I think if you're raiding or doing PvP, which you probably need to gear up, you should play Venthyr. And once you're geared up, if you're trying to push really high keys, I think Kyrian is nice. Kyrian is so good for prides. It's unbelievable how good Kyrian is for prides. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. So let's talk about Soulbinds. I've been running Pelagos with Kyrian. You should not run Braun in Mythic Plus because this guy like messes with invis pots and like pulls stuff, so you have to be really careful. It's possible that running Pointed Courage could be good, but none of the Soulbinds for Disc are really that good. This combat meditation is good for boon. It gives you a ton of mastery during your boon, and generally when you're booning, you have radiance on everybody, so it's giving you a ton of healing with that mastery, especially if you're not geared very well through mastery. That 350 mastery that you get during your boon is going to be huge. It's not ultimately the Kyrian Soulbinds aren't really that big for Disc Priest, but it certainly is nice. For potencies, you should almost always use the potency for your covenant. So for example, Courageous Ascension is insane with boon. Again, you're just, when you stack up combat meditation with Courageous Ascension with Twist of Fate and PI, now you see all this stuff coming together with boon. Your boon is essentially like a 10-second full party heal, and it's very, very strong, and it helps you deal with 20 stack prides. It helps you deal with seemingly unhealable damage as Disc Priest. It's very powerful. For your second potency, you have a little bit more room to mess around. If you're running Mindbender, I've found that Rabid Shadows is the best in terms of DPS and then therefore HPS. However, if you're running Shadow Fiend, I think Swift Penitence is better. Another good option is Shining Radiance. Both of these are pretty close. I think generally you should lean more towards Penitence or Rabid Shadows because they also deal damage. But if you're looking at pure HPS, I feel like Shining Radiance is close, and it could even be better in dungeons where you're doing a lot of AoE healing. Think like Theater or Sanguine Depths or something like that. I wouldn't mess with Exaltation or Pain Transformation or any of the other Covenant, any of the other things. For Endurance, Charitable Soul is really good, and Translucent Image is also very good. I feel like as much as you want to take a Finesse, you can't, like, both of these Endurance conduits are really good. Charitable Soul, if we're using Rapture on heavy damage moments, it gives you a ton of self-healing. Like, Leech plus Avoidance plus Charitable Soul helps you stay alive a lot. Translucent Image is also very, very good. It might seem like this isn't that strong, but as a priest, you have very, very little DR for yourself. Desperate Prayer doesn't even DR. All it does is give you max health. So if you want to reduce incoming damage, Translucent Image is actually great. 9% might not seem like a lot, but given that Fade is off the global and it's 30-second cooldown, you can press this a lot. Like, honestly, I think it might even be a good idea to just macro fade into all your buttons and just constantly be fading through the whole dungeon if you're not that used to pressing your fade for DR. But this is actually a disguisingly good conduit. For Finesse, if you can get good use out of Power Unto Others, then this is an amazing conduit as well. But in order to get good use out of this, you need to have multiple party members that use PI. So for example, let's say you're just using it on the mage over and over again. You're not like, you're never, this 9 seconds doesn't matter, right? Because you're basically going to PI every other combust. Because combust is about a minute, PI is 2 minutes. Having a 9-second cooldown reduction is going to get you 0 extra PI, so it's going to be useless. However, let's say you're playing with Mage and a Holy Paladin, or Mage and a Ret Paladin that you can use during Wings, right? Or some other class that uses the haste really well. If you're constantly just, if you always have a PI target that's good, this can be a really strong conduit as well. For Venthyr, since Venthyr is really popular too, I liked Draven. Stand Your Ground is really, really helpful versus Prides. It gives you max HP and it gives you 4% healing. It's tempting to use Thrill Seeker because it gives you haste, but I found that Draven probably gives you more health. Again, as I mentioned before in my Shaman video, be careful with Draven because if you release really fast, you're going to get in combat because of the Shatter passive, which is, you can't not take Shatter because it's one of the mandatory rows. So that's something to keep in mind. I haven't experimented too much with any of the Night Fae or Necrolord ones. I'd assume with Necrolord you run, well, no one's playing Necrolord, never mind. Let's talk about talents. There really isn't a lot to talk about in talents for Mythic Plus. So the first row, you're almost always playing Twist of Fate. If you're doing easy keys or keys where you don't feel like you get that much value out of Twist, like you don't really need to do that much healing, you're just slamming low keys, you can run Schism. However, Twist of Fate in harder healing scenarios always kicks in when you need it, and it's always there. It doesn't cost a global, you don't have to cast anything, right? Whereas Schism, it's more on demand, and if your team isn't dipping low, then you're not going to get value out of it, or you're not going to get value out of Twist. However, in an emergency, it adds another cast time, and if you have to move or you have to cast other stuff, you don't necessarily want to be casting Schism, and it's only adding damage, right? So I generally run Twist. However, if the key is easy, you can run Schism. This row, it doesn't really matter. Sometimes if I find that I'm struggling with Grievous or like Prides in general, you can run Mass Schism. However, Priest is really, really slow, so not having Feather feels bad. Body and Soul is okay too, but usually you want to be careful because this is going to, like, sometimes you're going to power word shield people and you don't want to be messing with people's movement speed, but any one of these talents are good depending on preference. This is by far the talent row I get asked the most about. I feel like most priests are running Solace, however, I choose to run Mindbender. Let's say you're just hitting a target dummy for Infinity. Solace is going to be better for damage and for mana, from my understanding. Not a whole lot better, but a little bit better. However, what Mindbender gives you is flexibility. So on my priest, I'm running Badge plus Mindbender, and I have the macro together, and I use this as a 1 minute cooldown, which is basically every pull, right? Every single pride, every single pull. I never had, like, it gives me a little bit of an extra cooldown. That way, in between my raptures, in between my, basically rapture is your big ability to heal other than boon. And when you don't have rapture, if you need to save rapture, Mindbender is a great ability. You can just set and forget it. And to me, I enjoy the flexibility. So think about this. Solace is just pure output. It does more. Mindbender is more flexible. If you just want to be able to press it and you don't want to not have to worry about cooldowns as much, because Mindbender in general does about, I think, 8 or 9k damage, maybe even 10k with the conduit, for me at least. So it gives you, it's like a 9k, 10k damage button that you can press every minute. And then plus I'm using my badge, which gives me a bunch of primary stat when I'm using it. So it's just a little mini cooldown that I have. Versus Shadow Fiend, which you may not even pair with a trinket, or it also just, you may, like, I find that with Shadow Fiend, I end up holding it, right? Because let's say there's a pride in 2 minutes. Well, my Shadow Fiend's up. I don't want to use my Shadow Fiend because it's going to be a 3-minute CD. So I end up holding on to Shadow Fiend, and I only get 1 use out of it over the course of 5 minutes. But with Mindbender, I can just press it, and then I can press it again, and then the pride, and I can press it again. So I feel like I get more value out of, like, if you're just pressing Shadow Fiend on cooldown and you can heal that way and you don't have to worry about it, then Solace is going to be better. But I find that Mindbender allows me not to have to think about my usage and use it more often, and therefore I think that'll make up for the damage and mana loss that I have from not running Solace. A little long-winded, but that's the one that gets asked a lot, so I wanted to explain my thoughts. This row, as a default, I like Shining Force just for a little bit of mob control, but I think Psychic Voice is okay too, especially if you're pugging or you have like a monk and you don't really need Shining Force. But this is nice, especially with like Sanguine and stuff like that. This row, I generally always run Sins of the Many. I run Shadow Covenant sometimes during Grievous specifically, just because I'm using Shadowmen so much during Grievous that just having Shadow Covenant is like something I can lean on to do a little bit more healing during my Shadowman spamming is helpful. The downside of Shadow Covenant is that it's not something you can use often because it locks you out of very, very important emergency abilities. Your defensives, your Rapture, your Pain Sup, your Dispels. And not having that, like, you can't just keep pressing Shadow Covenant over and over again. You might think, oh, it's got a 30-second cooldown, I can use it a lot. But you can't press it that much because it locks you out of important abilities. So that's why I generally prefer Sins of the Many. However, during Grievous, I do experiment a little bit with Shadow Covenant, and I kind of liked it. It helps with Prides, especially. That becomes a very tough part of Dispriest for Grievous, is Prides. Or just in general, bosses that do, like, a lot of group damage. This row, I'm always running Purge the Wicked. This row, I'm always running Lenience. Not much to say there. And lastly, I want to talk about Prides. And as you get up, Prides become one of the toughest parts of Dispriest. You don't necessarily... Did I DC? Oh, okay. Prides become one of the most difficult parts of Dispriest. And as you know, your team may be very uncomfortable when you're playing disc on Prides versus if they have a healer like either Shaman that has a bunch of group healing, or a healer like Paladin, which has, you can just Ashen Hollow and kill the Pride in one hit or whatever. So here's how I'm generally healing high Prides. If it's a Pride that's not too bad, I'm generally not going to worry too much about it. I'm just going to, do my thing. But on a Pride that's really hard that I'm really worried about, I have a pretty important system for it. So the most important thing going into the Pride is that you are set up for the Pride. Get people topped right away, because you don't want to, you don't want to have to spam Shadow Mend early on. You want to be able to contribute DPS. You want to be able to keep everyone topped. You want to be able to save mana. And if you go into the Pride and your team's all at half health, then it's going to be hard. It's going to be hard to do that. So going into the Pride, even the 30 seconds to a minute going into the Pride, be really conscious about topping everyone up and watching your mana. This is one of the few times where I might use Penance defensively just to try and save mana, whereas otherwise I would use Shadow Mend if I'm worried about that. This is where I would top everyone and just be careful. The big cooldowns that I want to save ideally are Rapture and Mindbender if I can, but you need at least one. Ideally, I'd like to have Barrier, and ideally, I'd like to have my Covenant ability. This is for really hard prides. This is where you're going to need to go through everything. So again, I get everyone topped right away. At the beginning of the Pride, I don't actually atone myself. I do this on purpose to proc Twist of Fate, because it's only going to proc if you heal someone below 35% health. And I found that even though there's other targets that might be safer, to let them dip low, people just don't really like that, especially if you're pugging. They're just going to press defensives and they're going to panic, and they don't realize that they're 100% okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to atone everybody. I'm going to save my radiance until I dip low. And I'm just going to DPS. I'm going to spam Shadow Mend. For the very little bit, the first part of the Pride, you can use Smite. But after the Pride gets to even 8 or 9 stacks, you don't want to be pressing Smite, because you just need to be constantly pressing Shadow Mend to heal people. The only time you're pressing Smite is if literally everyone is at full health, other than you, to proc Twist of Fate. So as soon as you dip low, if it's a really hard Pride, I'll press Desperate Prayer to proc my Twist of Fate. If you're below 35% health and you press Desperate Prayer, it's off the global and it counts as a heal that procs your Twist. So if you're in a rotation, if you're worried about the Pride and you need to proc your Twist on yourself, you can just press Desperate Prayer. Otherwise, I'll use Radiance. That way it'll renew all the atonements on everyone, plus get an atonement on me, which will therefore proc my Twist of Fate. Then once, that's maybe even just 10 or 15 seconds into the Pride, almost immediately you want to go into Shadow Mend spamming mode once that procs. And also with that, I'll use my Mindbender or my Shadow Fiend. And that's going to be my middle of the road. That doesn't do that much healing, but it's going to help you a decent amount. Ideally, you want to push people's health bars up all the way during that Twist of Fate. If possible, procking it on yourself, it's a little bit more difficult and it's a little bit scarier, but ideally you want to have Twist of Fate active as much as you can for that healing bonus. Once Mindbender becomes not enough, that's when I'm going to go into Rapture. Generally, when I'm pressing Rapture, I'm just spamming it on everyone but the tank. Usually the tank is okay during Pride, and I'm just spamming it. I don't use it on myself that much because of Charitable Soul, so maybe I'll use one shield on myself, and then most of the other shields will go on my teammates. But usually this 20% of these Rapture shields will be enough to sort of keep you top during Rapture. As soon as that Rapture ends, your team is going to get hit really hard, because you don't really have that much healing going on, right? Almost immediately, I try and throw down a Barrier after that. Barrier is tough in Mythic Plus because it's very situational. Your team needs to be close together, and during Pride, very often they're close together. If a lot of times I'll try and communicate to my team too, just to make sure they come in. I'll be like, yo, I'm throwing down a Barrier. Even if you have 1 or 2 people that are way off to the side, it's still probably worth pressing. Then out of my Barrier is when I use my Covenant ability. With Kyrian, you can hold this quite a bit because it will just top your whole group once you start using it, and for that whole 10 seconds. Otherwise, you're just using your Venthyr ability and you're just spamming Shadow Mend, just Shadow Mend, Shadow Mend, Shadow Mend. It's, you may try, you just can't atonement heal through Pride with anything. If you have Mind Blast, if you have Penance, you're going to press those buttons, obviously, but do not smite. Don't fall into the trap of smiting when a Pride is doing a decent amount of damage. You can do it at the very beginning, but smite is just a complete filler. Do not expect smite to heal. And this goes true with all healing in general, not just, Prides, obviously, but Prides are a great example of really high healing required. Do not smite. Don't get into, like, just spam Shadowmend. It seems bad, but literally just play whack-a-mole with Shadowmend. It feels bad, but as soon as you kill the Pride, then you have infinite mana anyway, and you don't care. So go cycle through all your cooldowns, Mindbender, then Rapture, then Barrier, then Covenant ability is my general order. Let's say you're going into the Pride and you feel like it's going to be either a hard Pride because of, you know, whatever reason, or you are missing cooldowns. PI is also a cooldown you can use on Pride. Don't be afraid to use PI on Pride. If you're running Twins of the Sun Priestess, it works doubly, right? You can PI anyone on any of your DPS to give them a little bit of extra damage, and you're giving this haste to yourself. So one thing I like to do a lot during Pride, if let's say I don't have cooldowns and things are tough and I have a Boomkin, I can PI someone on my team, let's say a rogue or a melee DPS that's doing damage, then I ask for Innervate, and then literally Shadowmend, and with that 60% haste and with the infinite mana, you can you can use that as a cooldown. And then even like to go even further with Grievous, you can use that with Shadow Covenant if you need a lot of healing, right? Like if you have PI active and then twist and then you get Innervate with Shadow Covenant, you're just like blasting healing. It's a little bit deceptive how much healing that Shadowmend does, but Shadowmend actually does a lot of healing. One press of it does 5,400 healing, which is, you know, a lot if you compare it to other healers besides Shaman. So that basically concludes my, you know, thoughts on all of Priest stuff, updated since I've been pushing high keys. I'll talk a little bit about how I think about the state of Priest right now. I've like flip-flopped a lot on Priest over the course of the expansion, but I basically arrived back to where I think of it now, where I thought of it at the beginning was it's okay. Like, it's really fun to play. It's very stressful. You know, you don't have a lot of straight upfront healing. You're constantly worrying about your mana. You're constantly worrying about your cooldowns. If you enjoy that like high pressure, like high thinking, like it's a more challenging healer, I think, than some of the other ones. The downside to Disc Priest is that I feel like the skill ceiling doesn't really give you that much. Disc Priest damage isn't really that high. And if you're playing super well and you're keeping your team alive, I feel like Disc should have similar damage. Maybe not the same damage as Paladin, but like maybe your damage plus PI. But I just feel like Disc doesn't really give you that much damage. And with the damage buffs to Shaman and with how much insane damage Paladins are doing, I feel like Disc doesn't really have that useful of a role. Like, there's some situations where if you can get a bunch of PIs on like a mage that's combusting with the Pride buff on huge pulls, yeah, but on single target especially, Disc is just really, really underwhelming damage wise, and it feels like a little bit punishing, where the fact that, you know, either A, you can play Shaman and just have an easier time healing, or B, you can play Paladin and do more damage. So just kind of, to me, feels kind of, it falls in the middle. It's 100% viable. I mean, you see me doing 25s, 24s with Disc Priest, doing even reasonable keys during Grievous. So I don't want you to think that I'm saying Disc is bad, but to me, I guess my thought is just like, it feels like I have to work really hard, and when everything comes together, it just doesn't feel as good as it should, you know, versus like when you do insane huge healing on a Shaman, you're doing like, you know, 18k HPS on a Pride, or when you have Ashen and Wings and you're just blasting on a boss with Paladin. It feels like just a little bit underwhelming, and I think that's why you don't see as many people playing Discs and high keys. It's not that they can't do it, it's just like, I think that Paladin and Shaman are better options for their respective, you know, what they're. So anyway, thanks for watching. Again, I apologize a little bit that it was, you know, very loose and it was just me talking, but I wanted to get my thoughts out on what I think of Disc Priest and the current state, and hopefully this advice helped you guys push higher keys. Thanks again for watching. Hope you guys have a great day, and happy keying.